Hey, welcome to Vice Grip Garage. I'm your unreliable host, Derek. The old finger remover 4000. Extra CFMs. No, they actually approved.
For years, Derek Bieri from Vice Grip Garage was known as the cheerful, grease-covered mechanic who could resurrect any forgotten relic sitting in a barn, a junkyard, or an open field. His videos were light-hearted, packed with humor, determination, and the kind of old-school charm that made millions fall in love with him. But today, the YouTube community is frozen in disbelief as shocking headlines spread faster than wildfire. Derek Bieri has been sentenced to life imprisonment, and the details behind this dramatic downfall are even more unbelievable than the announcement itself. Fans who once watched him battle rust and mechanical chaos are now trying to piece together how one of YouTube's most trusted mechanics ended up at the center of a case that has left viewers stunned, confused, and heartbroken. This isn't the story of a celebrity scandal or a minor legal slip. This is a case that authorities claim goes far deeper than anything his audience could have imagined. What began as a simple complaint quickly spiraled into a legal storm, one that slowly pulled Derek into a situation that grew darker with each passing week. As investigators dug deeper, surprising connections, hidden conflicts, and a chain of decisions pushed Derek into a corner from which he could not escape. Even his most loyal followers admit they never saw this coming. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the events that led to this shocking sentence, the accusations that turned Derek's world upside down, and the emotional fallout now rippling through the Vice Grip Garage community. Because behind every headline is a story, and behind this one is a man whose life changed forever. In a way no one expected, the moment the headline broke, the entire automotive community was thrown into chaos. Derek Bieri sentenced to life imprisonment. Fans refreshingly honest, mechanically gifted, and deeply family-oriented for over a decade could not believe what they were reading. Derek, the creator behind Vice Grip Garage, was known for saving forgotten relics, breathing life into engines that hadn't run in decades, and traveling across the country to rescue rusted-out machines most people would walk away from. Nothing about him matched the image of someone capable of ending up inside a courtroom, let alone receiving the harshest sentence imaginable. Yet the shockwave that followed his arrest was only the beginning of a story, far more complicated than anyone expected. According to investigators, the entire ordeal started with what many assumed was a misunderstanding involving a remote rural property. Derek had traveled out of state to pick up an old classic vehicle, abandoned on a piece of private land. What fans thought was another daring roadside revival suddenly spiraled into a serious legal conflict when a landowner claimed Derek entered the property without permission and removed a vehicle tied to an unresolved ownership dispute. In the world of abandoned classics, paperwork confusion isn't unusual. But this time the situation didn't fade with a handshake or a conversation. Instead, complaints mounted, and the authorities stepped in, turning what Derek believed was routine into a complicated legal case. As officers began investigating, they discovered that the land in question had been part of a long-standing dispute involving multiple owners stretching back decades. Some documents listed the vehicle as part of the estate. Others stated it was abandoned. Conflicting signatures, missing titles, and overlapping claims turned the case into a legal nightmare. Derek, who had recorded the pickup process for his channel, thought the footage would prove transparency and innocence. But prosecutors viewed the video differently. They argued that Derek knowingly proceeded despite the unclear situation, and suggested he had disregarded warnings from locals, who insisted the property wasn't free to access. Derek denied these claims, but once the footage was entered into evidence, the tone of the investigation shifted dramatically. Within weeks, investigators started pulling up old complaints filed over the years, involving similar situations, minor disputes that had never been publicized. None of these past issues were criminal, and many were resolved privately. But prosecutors used them to build a pattern of behavior they said showed Derek repeatedly skirted legal boundaries in pursuit of rare vehicles. Fans pushed back hard, claiming such accusations were exaggerated or connected to rival collectors who were jealous of Derek's popularity. But behind the scenes, legal pressure continued to build. The escalation reached a boiling point when a witness stepped forward claiming Derek had been involved in a heated confrontation months earlier during another vehicle retrieval. The witness alleged that the argument grew out of control, leading the prosecution to reopen and re-examine several incidents that had previously seemed unrelated, despite Derek's insistence that the confrontation was nothing more than a disagreement blown out of proportion. Prosecutors now included the incident as a key part of their case. As the court date approached, Derek's supporters filled social media with messages defending his character, but the legal machine moved forward with intense speed. Analysts tracking the case were stunned by how aggressively prosecutors pursued it. They argued the case was no longer about one vehicle, it was about repeated decisions that allegedly violated property laws, ignored posted restrictions, and complicated decades-old disputes. Derek's legal team fought back, insisting he never acted intentionally and that the prosecution was mishandling minor, unrelated issues to paint a darker picture. Inside the courtroom, Derek appeared overwhelmed but determined, facing accusations far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Every detail of his work, his videos, his roadside rescues, and even his personal behavior became scrutinized. Fans watching coverage described the proceeding as surreal, almost unreal, as if their favorite creator had been thrown into a situation far larger and more dangerous than anything connected to classic cars. By the time the jury heard the prosecution's full narrative, the case had shifted from a misunderstanding to a portrayal of systematic misconduct. Derek's supporters insisted the truth was being distorted, but the tension in the courtroom showed how seriously the jury took each piece of evidence. And as the first chapter of this story unfolded, it became clear that Derek Bieri's situation was spiraling into something far more devastating than anyone thought possible. As the trial entered its next phase, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from confusion to pure intensity. What had begun as a dispute involving a single vehicle now grew into a sprawling legal storm that pulled in witnesses, experts, past property owners, and even former collaborators who had worked with Derek on Vice Grip Garage. Prosecutors claimed that Derek's actions, though documented with humor and transparency on video, showed a pattern of disregard for boundaries, titles, and ownership laws. His defense team countered fiercely, insisting he always sought proper permission and followed every legitimate step required to obtain abandoned vehicles. But when multiple landowners testified, the case suddenly took a turn that no one saw coming. One witness described an old pickup Derek had retrieved from a dilapidated farm years earlier. At the time, fans had praised the save, celebrating Derek for breathing life into a truck destined for scrap. But the landowner claimed the vehicle was part of an unsettled estate dispute between feuding family members. Although the paperwork had been chaotic, prosecutors used the testimony to argue that Derek had failed to conduct due diligence and walked straight into a situation he should have clarified more thoroughly. Derek insisted he had signed documentation provided by a relative who claimed to be the rightful owner, but prosecutors challenged the validity of those documents, turning what Derek believed was an innocent misunderstanding into alleged evidence of negligence. More testimonies followed, and the complexity of each story seemed to strengthen the prosecution's case. Some witnesses admitted they had never directly confronted Derek but claimed they felt pressured or uncomfortable during his retrievals. Others alleged that Derek had been warned about disputed boundaries multiple times over the years. The defense pushed back, presenting emails, text messages, and footage showing Derek politely asking for permission in each case. But the more the prosecution expanded the narrative, the more it appeared to the jury as a long chain of questionable circumstances, rather than isolated incidents. In a surprising move, prosecutors also introduced a series of online messages from individuals claiming to have alerted Derek about the risks of entering certain rural properties. Many of these messages were vague, unverified, or posted anonymously, but the prosecution framed them as proof that Derek knowingly ignored warnings. His defense argued the messages were meaningless and could have been written by anyone, especially once Derek's popularity attracted attention. Fans following the trial online called this strategy unfair and desperate. Still, The jury was instructed to consider whether Derek had been sufficiently aware of potential control rise during his vehicle hunts. Then came the most damaging testimony of all. A former acquaintance from the automotive community, who claimed Derek had once boasted about retrieving vehicles from gray areas of property law. The defense questioned the credibility of this witness, highlighting discrepancies in his statements, but the prosecution leaned on the testimony heavily, suggesting it painted Derek as someone who knowingly exploited ambiguous situations. Derek firmly denied ever making such comments, yet by the end of the second chapter of his legal battle, Derek's situation had shifted dramatically. What once seemed like a solvable misunderstanding had now snowballed into a full-blown legal saga, one that threatened not only his freedom but everything he had built through years of dedication to classic cars and honest storytelling. As Derek's trial advanced into its final stages, the pressure inside the courtroom became almost suffocating. The prosecution had spent weeks assembling a narrative portraying him as a man who repeatedly crossed property boundaries and ignored legal warnings, while the defense insisted Derek was being unfairly targeted and misunderstood. But the decisive moment came when an unexpected piece of evidence surfaced, a discovery that shifted the courtroom's mood from tense to explosive. Investigators had uncovered an old recorded phone call connected to a long-simmering dispute involving the same rural land that sparked the entire case. Although Derek wasn't the one speaking in the recording, prosecutors claimed his name was mentioned in a way that could be interpreted as involvement in a larger conflict. The recording featured two individuals arguing over vehicle rights, land access, and long-forgotten agreements between distant relatives. At one point, one of the speakers angrily stated that someone like Derek had been poking around where he shouldn't. The prosecution seized on this statement, suggesting it proved Derek had been warned long before the incident that triggered the case. The defense objected fiercely, arguing the comment was vague, speculative, and lacked context. But the jury had already heard it, and the tension in the room doubled. The prosecution presented the recording as evidence that Derek knowingly put himself in a situation that had been disputed for years. With the new evidence introduced, the courtroom atmosphere grew darker. The prosecution doubled down on its narrative, bringing up every prior complaint, every unclear title, and every questionable boundary line to argue that Derek's actions were part of a long pattern. They portrayed him not as a harmless mechanic, but as someone who repeatedly stepped into situations he should have avoided. Derek, who had always viewed himself as a guy trying to save forgotten classics, now found his character reduced to a list of alleged oversights and missteps that the prosecution insisted were part of a deliberate pattern. The defense countered with equal determination. They reminded the jury of Derek's long-standing reputation for honesty, integrity, and transparency. They played clips from his videos showing him asking for permission, respecting property lines, and dealing kindly with landowners. His attorney argued that Derek always sought to do the right thing, and that the prosecution's portrayal ignored his consistent efforts to ensure everything was legal. They insisted the recording was taken out of context and had been stretched far beyond its intended meaning. But the jury had absorbed weeks of testimony by that point, and the complexity of the case made it increasingly difficult to separate fact from speculation. In a move that surprised everyone, the prosecution called Derek to the stand. His attorney advised him against it, but Derek chose to speak, believing his honesty would shine through. As he sat in the witness chair, his voice steadied at first, explaining how he retrieved vehicles, how he sought permission, and how he relied on the information given to him by owners and family members. But as the prosecution began questioning him, his calm demeanor slowly faded. They grilled him on every minor detail, every missing paper, every ambiguous conversation, every moment where a landowner claimed they felt uncomfortable. Derek struggled under the pressure. His words tangled, and moments that seemed simple on video became complicated when dissected in a courtroom. The prosecution pointed to these moments as proof he didn't take legal boundaries seriously enough. The emotional strain on Derek was unmistakable. At one point, he paused mid-sentence, staring down at the table as if trying to summon the strength to continue. His supporters, seated a few rows back, watched helplessly as a man known for his confidence in front of a camera now found himself overwhelmed by the weight of a system far more intimidating than any rusted engine. When Derek finally stepped down from the stand, the courtroom felt heavier than ever. Analysts later said his testimony, though heartfelt, may have unintentionally strengthened the prosecution's case by opening more questions than it answered. And as the third chapter of this story concluded, it became clear that Derek's fate was now hanging by a thread, one that could snap at any moment. When the jury finally retreated to deliberate, the courtroom felt frozen in place. Derek sat quietly at the defense table, staring at his hands as if trying to brace himself for whatever was coming next. His family whispered soft words of comfort, but the fear in their eyes revealed the truth. They were preparing for the unthinkable. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse, many holding signs or wearing Vice Grip Garage shirts, hoping their presence would somehow shift the outcome. But inside those deliberation walls, nothing could influence what 12 strangers decided about Derek Bieri's future. Hours stretched into a full day, and tension filled the hallway as reporters hovered, waiting for any indication of a verdict. Derek's attorney tried to remain optimistic, reminding him that long deliberations could mean the jury was struggling with the prosecution's complicated narrative. But Derek appeared numb, replaying everything in his mind: the testimonies, the questions, the moments where he felt misunderstood, and the complicated land dispute that had started this entire ordeal. He kept insisting the truth would prevail, but as time passed, that certainty slowly slipped away. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. Derek rose to his feet, his face pale, his shoulders tense. The judge asked the foreperson if a verdict had been reached. The foreperson nodded. What followed felt like a slow-motion moment that Derek would later describe as the longest breath of my life. The verdict: guilty on multiple counts related to unlawful property access, improper acquisition of disputed vehicles, and aggravated circumstances connected to the earlier confrontation introduced during the trial. The collective gasp that filled the room echoed through every row. Derek's family broke down. Even some reporters looked stunned. No one had expected such a devastating conclusion. But the real shock came moments later when the judge announced the sentence. Because the combined charges, escalated by the prosecution's framing of repeated actions over many years, fell under enhanced penalty guidelines, the judge ruled that Derek would receive life imprisonment. The courtroom erupted in disbelief. Derek's attorney immediately objected, calling the sentence disproportionate and preparing for an appeal. Supporters cried out in protest, and security quickly stepped forward to keep order. Derek stood there frozen, appearing as if the weight of the entire world had collapsed onto him in a single moment. His life, his work, his family, and his future, all of it shattered in seconds. As guards approached to take him into custody, Derek looked back at his wife and children. That moment, captured by courtroom artists and later described by those present, became one of the most heart-wrenching images of the entire trial. His wife reached out with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face, while his children clung to her side, visibly broken. Derek mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," though no one in his family believed he had done anything deserving of such a fate. The judge called for order again, but the emotional devastation in the room made silence impossible outside the courthouse. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Fans flooded social media, calling the outcome a miscarriage of justice and demanding the sentence be overturned. Automotive channels and creators rallied around Derek, publishing videos in his defense and questioning how a man known for rescuing junkyard relics could be punished more severely than people convicted of far more serious crimes. Some legal commentators speculated that the prosecution had stretched the case beyond its natural limits, using Derek's public profile and video content to build a narrative harsher than the facts warranted. But none of that changed the reality Derek now faced. Inside the county jail, Derek spent his first night in a small, cold cell. Those close to him later described him as heartbroken and lost, not because of fear for himself, but because of the pain he knew his family was experiencing. He had always been a man who fought to restore broken things, cars, trucks, and stories long forgotten. But this time, he was the one who felt discarded, trapped in a situation he could not fix. And as this chapter closed, one thing became painfully clear. The journey that began with a simple roadside rescue had spiraled into a tragedy so overwhelming that even Derek's toughest battles under the hood could never have prepared him for what awaited beyond the steel bars of his new reality.